Loretta Boggs drove the first nail at 6 in the morning, and by the time the sun cleared the eastern ridge, she had already pulled 14 rotting boards off the front wall of the smokehouse and stacked them in the wet grass beside the door. The hammer was too heavy for her. It was a miner's framing hammer, built for a man's grip, and it made her wrist ache after every third swing. She didn't stop. She had learned, in the 11 months since her husband's funeral, that pain was just a clock. It told you time was passing. It didn't tell you to quit. Come settle in tonight, wherever you are, driving, resting, lying in the dark. This is a story about a woman who built the only thing her hollow had never had, in a building everyone told her was cursed. Stay close. The smokehouse stood 40 yards behind the main cabin, on a flat shelf of land cut into the mountainside, surrounded by a thicket of blackberry cane so dense that Loretta had spent 2 full days hacking a path to the door with a corn knife. The structure itself was 12 feet by 20, built of hand-hewn poplar logs, with a fieldstone foundation and a cedar shake roof that had been good once, but now sagged in the middle like a horse's back gone sway. The door hung from one iron hinge. The chinking between the logs had crumbled to dust. The interior walls were black with decades of creosote from the smoking fires that had once burned inside, and the air still carried a faint, sharp ghost of hickory smoke, even though no fire had been lit in this building in 44 years. No one in Painter Creek Hollow would tell Loretta why. She had arrived 3 weeks ago, on the 7th of September, 1941, carrying a cardboard suitcase, a canvas bag of medical supplies, and a letter from the Harlan County clerk confirming that the property, 11 acres of steep mountain land, 1 4-room cabin with a stone chimney, 1 smokehouse, 1 springhouse, and a half-acre tobacco patch gone to seed, now belonged to her. It had been her husband Roy's family land. Roy's people had lived on this ridge for 4 generations, since before the Civil War. Roy himself had left at 19 to work the mines in Cranston, where he met Loretta, married her, and died at 34 when a pocket of methane gas ignited in Shaft 7 of the Consolidated Coal Company's Black Mountain mine on November 12, 1940. The explosion killed Roy and 6 other men. The company paid Loretta a settlement of $85 and a letter that said the word regret 4 times without ever using the word responsibility. Loretta was 32 years old. She had no children. She had worked for 3 years as an assistant at Dr. Abernathy's clinic in Cranston before her marriage. Not a nurse. Not officially, but she had learned to clean wounds, set simple fractures, administer iodine, measure doses of quinine and aspirin, and recognize the difference between a cold and pneumonia by the sound of a patient's breathing. After Roy died, Dr. Abernathy offered her the assistant position back. She turned it down. She packed the medical supplies he let her take: iodine, aspirin, gauze rolls, a blood pressure cuff, a stethoscope, 3 surgical needles, catgut thread, and a battered copy of the Merck manual, and came to Roy's mountain. She came because she had nowhere else to go, and because the letter from the county clerk had included a handwritten note from Roy's uncle, Harmon Boggs, that said, "There's no doctor here. The company man comes once a month if the roads hold. People are dying of things that shouldn't kill anyone. If you know medicine, come." She came. And the first thing she noticed, after the silence of the hollow and the height of the ridges and the particular way mountain people looked at a woman arriving alone, was the smokehouse. It sat apart from the other structures, separated not just by distance but by something else. A deliberate avoidance. The blackberry cane around it hadn't been cut in years. No path led to its door. When she asked Harmon about it, on her first evening, sitting on the cabin porch while he smoked a pipe and the katydids screamed in the dark, he looked at the ground and said, "That's the condemned place. Don't go in there. Why not? People died in there. That's all you need to know." Loretta went in the next morning, The man who built the smokehouse was named Silas Boggs, and he built it with his own hands in the spring of 1863, when the Civil War was tearing through the mountains, and every family in the hollow was choosing sides or trying not to. Silas was 51 years old, barrel-chested, with a beard that reached his collarbone, and hands so calloused the skin had turned the color and texture of old saddle leather. He had come to Painter Creek from Virginia in 1839, cleared the land, married a woman named Prudence, who bore him 7 children, and died of childbed fever with the 8th, and lived on this ridge for 24 years without asking permission from anyone for anything. He built the smokehouse large on purpose, 12 by 20, when most men built theirs 8 by 10. His neighbors asked why a man needed a smokehouse big enough to cure a whole hog standing up. Silas said, "Because I plan to cure a whole hog standing up." But that wasn't the real reason. Silas built it large because he had watched 3 of his own children die before their 5th birthdays. 2 from scarlet fever, 1 from a fall, and he understood that in a place with no doctor, no church, and no law closer than 2 days' ride, the only thing between a person and death was a room with a roof, a fire, and someone willing to sit with them through the night. The smokehouse was both things at once. In autumn, it smoked venison and pork, and wild turkey, the hickory fires burning low and steady for days, filling the hollow with a smell so rich that dogs came from a mile away and sat in the yard with their tongues out. But in winter, when the fevers came, and the croup took the children, and a man could break his leg on the ice and lie in a creek bed for hours. Before anyone found him, the smokehouse became the other thing. Silas would clear the meat hooks, lay down straw pallets on the stone floor, build the fire hot, and carry the sick inside. He'd sit with them. He couldn't cure them. He had no medicine beyond whiskey, honey, and a stubbornness that refused to let a person die alone. But he could keep them warm, he could keep them fed, and he could keep them separate from the healthy, which was the one thing he understood that no one else in the hollow seemed to. That sickness traveled from body to body like fire through dry leaves, and the only way to stop it was to put distance between the burning and the unburned. For 34 years, the smokehouse served both purposes. Silas Boggs smoked meat in the autumn and tended the sick in the winter, and the people of Painter Creek came to trust the building the way they trusted the spring house or the church, as a fixed point in a world that was constantly trying to shake them loose. Then, in the autumn of 1897, diphtheria came to the hollow, and everything Silas had built was destroyed in 9 weeks. It took Loretta 9 days to make the smokehouse usable. She replaced the 14 rotted wallboards with salvaged lumber from a collapsed chicken coop behind the cabin. She mixed fresh chinking from creek clay and horsehair and packed it between every log with her bare hands until her fingers cracked and bled. She swept the stone floor, scrubbed it with lye soap until the creosote faded from black to dark gray, and laid down clean pine boards she bought for $3 from the sawmill at Waller's Gap. She rehung the door on 2 new hinges. She patched the cedar shake roof with flattened tin cans. She built a set of rough shelves from scrap poplar and arranged her medical supplies, the iodine, the aspirin, the gauze, the stethoscope, the Merck manual, in a row that she could reach without looking, the way Dr. Abernathy had taught her. On the 6th day of cleaning, she found the carvings. She had been scrubbing the interior north wall, the darkest wall, the one that had absorbed the most creosote from decades of smoking fires. When her rag caught on something beneath the soot, she rubbed harder. A line appeared, then another. She brought the kerosene lantern close and scrubbed with turpentine until the black peeled away and showed her what was underneath: names, dozens of them, carved directly into the poplar log with a knife blade, each one followed by a date and a single word. Lived or lost Ruth Ellen Prater, age 4. November 1897, Lived. James Woodrow Combs, age 7, November 1897. Lived. Infant Sizemore, unnamed, age 11 days, November 1897. Lost. Martha Caroline Boggs, age 3, December 1897. Lived. Thomas Henry Webb, age 9, December 1897. Lost. There were 41 names. 27 said lived. 14 said lost. Loretta ran her fingers across the carvings. The knife marks were deep, deliberate, each letter cut with the care of someone who understood that these names might be the only record that these children had existed. At the bottom of the wall, below the last name, was a longer carving. The letters were larger, uneven, as if the hand that made them had been shaking. I kept who I could. God took who he wanted. Blame me if it helps. S.B.'s Silas Boggs, her husband's grandfather. The man who had built this smokehouse and had, apparently, used it as something more than a place to cure meat. Loretta pressed her palm flat against the carved initials. The wood was cold and rough under her hand. She had just found out why the smokehouse was condemned. Diphtheria arrived in Painter Creek on the boots of a timber buyer from Lexington, who stayed 2 nights at the Combs boarding house and left with a handshake and a cough. Within a week, 3 children were sick. Within 2 weeks, 11. The disease moved through the hollow, the way fire moves through a hay barn, fast, invisible until it was too late, and hungriest for the smallest and weakest. Silas Boggs was 71 years old when the outbreak began, and he had buried enough children in his lifetime to recognize the gray membrane forming in the backs of their throats before the mothers did. He had no medicine, he had no training. What he had was the smokehouse and a single desperate idea. He went door to door in the hollow on the morning of October 29, 1897, and made a proposal that half the families accepted and half refused. Bring your children to the smokehouse. He would keep them warm, keep them fed, keep them separated from the sick adults, and keep the smoking fire burning day and night because he believed, correctly, though he had no scientific language for it, that the hot, dry, smoke-heavy air inside the building made it harder for the sick to breathe. 17 families brought their children. 14 families refused, calling Silas a fool, a meddler, or worse, a man who wanted to lock children inside a building so he could play God. The families who refused kept their children at home, in the same rooms as the sick, sharing the same beds, breathing the same air. Over the next 9 weeks, 41 children in Painter Creek Hollow contracted diphtheria. Of the 24 children Silas quarantined in the smokehouse, 21 survived. Of the 17 children whose families kept them at home, only 6 survived, 27 lived, 14 lost. The numbers were carved into the wall, but numbers, in a hollow full of grieving parents, did not matter the way they should have. Loretta's first patient was a 6-year-old girl named Della Mae Prater, who had stepped on a rusty nail, and whose foot had swollen to twice its normal size, the skin around the puncture turning an angry red streaked with darker lines running up toward her ankle. Della Mae's mother, Opal, had been soaking the foot in warm salt water for 3 days. It was getting worse. Opal carried Della Mae up the hill to the smokehouse on a Tuesday morning because she had heard from Harmon, who had heard from his wife, who had heard from the woman who sold eggs at the general store, that Roy Boggs's widow had medical supplies and knew how to use them. Loretta cleaned the wound with iodine, removed a fragment of rust embedded in the flesh with a sterilized needle, applied a fresh gauze dressing, and gave Opal a small bottle of aspirin for the fever. She did not charge anything. The entire treatment took 20 minutes. Word traveled faster than Loretta expected. Within 2 weeks, she had treated a broken collarbone, a 12-year-old boy who had fallen from a walnut tree, a severe burn, a woman whose sleeve caught fire at the cook stove, an abscessed tooth, an old man who had been in pain for 6 weeks and had been drinking whiskey to cope, and 3 cases of roundworm in children under 5. She treated every patient in the smokehouse. She kept the door open during daylight hours. She hung a clean white flour sack cloth from the porch overhang, visible from the road below, so people would know the clinic was open. The smokehouse, for the first time in 44 years, had smoke rising from its chimney again. The first enemy arrived on the third week. His name was Dr. Vernon Skaggs, and he was the Consolidated Coal Company's appointed physician for the Painter Creek district. He visited the hollow once a month, sometimes every 6 weeks if the roads were bad, and charged $2 per examination and sold patent medicines from a leather case for prices that no miner's family could afford but paid anyway because they had no alternative. Dr. Skaggs was not a bad doctor. He was a lazy one. He diagnosed by glance, prescribed by habit, and left before the coffee cooled. He had held this position for 8 years and had never once made a house call to a home without road access. When Skaggs heard that a woman with no medical degree was treating patients in a smokehouse, using supplies she had stolen from a clinic in Cranston, he drove his company car to Painter Creek and parked it in front of Harmon Boggs's cabin. "She has no license," Skaggs told Harmon, standing in the yard with his medical bag on his hip and his hat tilted to keep the rain off his spectacles. "What she is doing is illegal. If someone dies under her care, the family can sue. The company can sue. The county can shut this hollow down as a health hazard." "Nobody's died," Harmon said. Yet Skaggs replied. The second enemy was quieter and more dangerous. Reverend Asa Whitaker had been preaching at the Painter Creek Church of God for 19 years. A thin man with a voice like a saw blade, who believed that sickness was a test from the Almighty and that medicine was, at best, an act of insufficient faith and at worst, an act of pride. He did not confront Loretta directly. He preached about her. From the pulpit on 3 consecutive Sundays, he told the congregation that a woman who sets herself up as a healer in a place where God has already spoken is building on cursed ground. He reminded them of what had happened in the smokehouse in 1897. He reminded them of the 14 children who died. He did not mention the 27 who lived. If you're listening right now, maybe it's late, maybe you're driving, maybe you're drifting off, and you've ever had someone question whether you had the right to help, whether you were qualified enough, experienced enough, allowed enough to do what you knew in your bones was needed. Then you know what Loretta was feeling. Leave a like for her. She can't hear it, but you can. Inside the smokehouse, Silas Boggs had not slept in 4 days. 24 children lay on straw pallets on the stone floor, arranged in 2 rows, with a narrow aisle between them. The youngest was 11 days old, the Sizemore infant, born premature, small enough to fit in Silas's 2 cupped hands. The oldest was 13, a boy named Calvin Prater, who had carried his own younger siblings to the smokehouse on his back because their mother was too sick to walk. Silas kept the hickory fire burning in the stone pit at the center of the room, low and steady, enough to keep the air warm and thick with smoke, but not enough to choke. He boiled creek water in an iron kettle and spooned it into the children's mouths, one at a time, round the clock. He made broth from dried venison. He changed the straw under the sickest children when it became soaked with sweat. He sang, not hymns, but old ballads his mother had brought from Virginia. Songs about rivers and horses, and a woman who waited on a hill for someone who never came back. 3 children died in the first week. The Sizemore infant, who had been too small and too early and too fragile for any intervention to reach. A 4-year-old boy named Daniel Hensley, who stopped breathing at 2 in the morning, while Silas was feeding broth to another child 6 feet away. And a 9-year-old girl named Eliza Combs, who had been sick before she arrived, and whose mother had waited too long to bring her. Each time a child died, Silas carried the body outside himself. He wrapped them in clean cloth. He dug the graves in the frozen ground behind the smokehouse with a pickaxe because the earth was too hard for a shovel. He did not ask for help. He did not stop working. By December, the worst had passed. The surviving children recovered one by one. The coughing eased, the membranes receded, the fevers broke. Silas returned them to their families. 21 children walked out of the smokehouse alive. But the 14 who died, in the smokehouse, and in the homes that refused to send their children, became a single number in the Hollow's memory. 14 children dead, and the smokehouse, where Silas had fought to save them, became the place where they died. The distinction between died despite his efforts and died because of his efforts was too fine for grief to parse. The Hollow needed someone to blame, and Silas was standing in the building where the bodies had been. By January 1898, no one spoke to Silas Boggs. His neighbors walked past his cabin without looking up, the families whose children he had saved. 21 of them, alive, breathing, growing, said nothing in his defense. Gratitude, in a place that small and that wounded, felt too much like admitting they had been wrong to doubt him. Silas carved the names into the smokehouse wall, all 41, lived and lost, hung the padlock, and never opened the door again. He died in the spring of 1903, alone in the cabin at the age of 77. The cause of death, if anyone had cared to investigate, was pneumonia. But Harmon Boggs, who found the body, said later that his uncle had been dying of silence for 5 years before his lungs gave out. The whooping cough arrived in Painter Creek 3 days before Christmas. It started with the Prater children, Della Mae, whose foot Loretta had healed 2 months earlier, and her 2 younger brothers, ages 4 and 2. The cough was unmistakable, a deep, convulsive bark, followed by a desperate gasping inhale that produced a sound like a broken whistle. Within a week, 9 children in the Hollow were sick. Within 2 weeks, 14. Dr. Skaggs was not coming. The roads were iced over, and Skaggs had sent word through the company foreman that he would visit when conditions allowed. Conditions, in the mountains in December, did not allow much. Loretta opened the smokehouse at 6 in the morning and did not close it until midnight. She converted the clinic into a treatment ward. The same thing Silas had done 44 years before, in the same building, on the same stone floor. She laid down clean pallets. She kept the stove burning hot. She boiled water continuously for steam, because the Merck manual said that warm, humid air eased the spasms in the bronchial passages. She measured doses of aspirin for fever, 1/4 tablet for children under 3, 1/2 for children under 8, 1 full tablet for older children. She timed the coughing fits with Roy's pocket watch, counting the seconds between spasms to track whether each child was improving or worsening. 7 mothers brought their children to the smokehouse. 6 refused. The 6 who refused gave the same reasons the Hollow had given in 1897. The building was cursed. Children had died there. God would provide. Reverend Whitaker visited 3 of the 6 families personally and prayed at each bedside, his thin voice rising through the cabin walls into the cold mountain air. Loretta did not argue with the families who refused. She did not go to their doors. She did not beg. She kept the white cloth hanging from the smokehouse porch, and she kept the door open, and she kept working. On the 4th night, Opal Prater's youngest boy, 2 years old, named Roy after Loretta's dead husband, a coincidence that made Loretta's throat close every time she said his name, stopped breathing during a coughing fit. His lips turned blue. His tiny body went rigid, then limp. Loretta cleared his airway with her finger, tilted his head back the way Dr. Abernathy had shown her, and breathed into his mouth. 1 breath, 2, 3, until his chest rose on its own and the color crept back into his face. Opal, standing in the doorway, sank to her knees. That was the night the Hollow changed its mind. By morning, 3 of the 6 refusing families had brought their children to the smokehouse. By the following evening, all 6 had come. The building that had been condemned for 44 years, was full of children again. 14 of them, coughing and whimpering and sleeping in the warm steam, while Loretta moved between the pallets, with the pocket watch in one hand and the stethoscope around her neck. On the 7th night, Loretta's hands were shaking from exhaustion. She had not slept more than 2 hours in 4 days. She was measuring aspirin doses on the table when she felt a hand on her shoulder. She turned. Opal Prater stood behind her, holding a clean apron and a kettle of fresh broth. "Sit down," Opal said. "I'll do the next round." Behind Opal, 3 more women stood in the doorway. Ada Combs, Virgie Webb, and old Elspeth Sizemore, who was 73, and whose own unnamed infant sister was one of the 14 names carved on the north wall. They had brought blankets, firewood, and a pot of bean soup large enough to feed 20 people. "You ain't doing this alone," Elspeth said. "Silas tried to do it alone, and it broke him. We ain't letting it happen twice." They worked in shifts. Loretta supervised the medical care, the doses, the steam, the breathing checks every 30 minutes. The women handled everything else: the feeding, the cleaning, the firewood, the comfort. They sang to the children at night, the same old ballads Silas had sung, songs about rivers and horses, and a woman waiting on a hill. They didn't know they were singing Silas's songs. The songs had traveled from mouth to mouth across 44 years, changing a word here, a melody there, but carrying the same weight. Not one child died, 14 sick, 14 recovered. Every single one walked out of the smokehouse on their own feet by the 2nd week of January 1942, blinking in the winter sunlight like small animals emerging from a long burrow. Dr. Skaggs arrived on January 19th, 3 weeks after the outbreak began, the roads finally clear. He examined the children, all recovering, and wrote in his report that the community managed the outbreak adequately in his absence. He did not mention Loretta. He did not enter the smokehouse. Reverend Whitaker did not preach against Loretta again. He did not apologize either. He simply stopped mentioning her, which in a place like Painter Creek was as close to a retraction as a man like that would ever offer. On a cold morning in February, Loretta took a knife and carved 2 new lines into the north wall of the smokehouse, below Silas's 41 names, December 1941, January 1942. Whooping cough, 14 children, all lived, LB. She ran her fingers one more time over Silas's carved initials, SB, and the words he had left behind. "I kept who I could." She understood him now, not as a story, not as a ghost, not as the cursed man the Hollow remembered. As a person who had done the only thing that mattered when nothing else was available. He had stayed in the room. On the first warm day of March, Harmon Boggs and 4 other men from the Hollow rebuilt the smokehouse porch without being asked. They replaced the sagging roof with new cedar shakes. They cut back the blackberry cane and cleared a proper path from the road. Opal Prater painted a sign on a board and nailed it above the door. It read, in plain black letters, "Painter Creek, Clinic Est, 1863 Re-Est, 1941 the 2 dates. The old man and the young woman, 78 years apart, in the same building doing the same work for the same reason." Below the sign, someone, no one would later admit to it, had carved 3 words into the doorframe. He kept, she keeps, on spring mornings, when the dogwoods bloomed white along the ridge and the creek ran clear and the children played in the road below. Loretta would open the smokehouse door, hang the white cloth from the porch, and sit at her table beside the wall of names, waiting for whoever needed her next. The building smelled of cedar smoke and iodine and something older than both, the particular warmth of a place that has been used again and again to hold people together when everything else is trying to pull them apart. If this story stayed with you tonight, if Silas's stubbornness or Loretta's steadiness or Opal's hand on a tired shoulder meant something to you, then do this. Share it with someone who has ever kept going when everyone told them to stop. And tell us in the comments, is there a place in your town, in your family, that once held people together? A building, a porch, a kitchen table? We'd love to hear about it. We'll see you soon, down another hollow road.